Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. Time for the Writestream. Number 10 for this round of Writestreams. I realize that there's a whole nother set of Writestreams with like 100 other Writestreams on them. So this is number 10. We're going to talk today about prose. Maybe we'll do some live writing and just go over some of the technical aspects of that, because this is where I think a lot of people get caught up in the muck, is figuring out how to write prose, and then, like I talked about last week, how to write dialogue. So we'll do some live writing for both of those things to dial them in, and just to make sure that people have an idea, like, what does it mean to write good prose? Like, what makes prose good? And the truth is, prose doesn't actually need to be all that good. And actually, dialogue doesn't need to be that good either. What matters is that it is effectively communicating the story. So that'll be, I guess, the narrative for today, is that it will be effectively communicating the story to people. Because what we don't want is prose that gets in the way of someone reading the story, makes someone close a book, or makes someone lose track of what you're doing. So it's better to write simple prose that is direct and says exactly what it's supposed to say than it is to attempt to write florid, complex literary prose and lose your reader along the way. So knowing who your reader is also part of writing good prose. Let me start with this. So what is prose? Well, when we're writing a prose narrative, such as a book, of which I have many. By the way, you can join Patreon. My Patreon, which allows you to have access to my Discord server and pick my brain and just see what I'm doing in all of those other times rather than normal. So you can check that out. Patreon.com/DavidVStewart. Of course, don't forget about the No Talkie Talkie channel. I will just link a video and you can watch the newest video. That's the Zul Online channel. So no talkie talkies on that one at all. And this one is, I guess, exclusive talkie talk. Should I wear the wizard hat? I don't know. I only have 15 people so far, so that's good. I haven't been monitoring the other platforms. Like right now I'm streaming on like 4 or 5 different platforms. So, I'm not sure who's watching on any other platform besides this one, besides YouTube, which is the main one. So I'll wait a few minutes to get a lot of other people in. Usually I have like a little music performance, but I figured I'd skip that today and hop right into the good stuff and talk about what prose is. So what is prose? Let's start with that. What is prose? Prose is basically all the stuff that isn't dialogue. All of the words that are in the book which are not the words that characters are saying. So these are usually written in paragraphs, right? They will describe the things that are happening. So what should your prose do? Well, it should describe the things which the dialogue does not, because it is not the dialogue. So if the dialogue is communicating a character's intent, a character's feelings, a character's plans and motivations, the prose doesn't need to do that. So you don't need to include in little snippets in with the dialogue how a character felt about something, unless it's I'll talk about this, unless it's in something like a first-person perspective and there's an internal thought. But that internal thought is somewhat like a piece of dialogue, rather than just a piece of the, I guess, prose itself, but it will be in the form of prose. So most of the time you don't want to include that the character felt happy or said happily or things like that. That kind of goes into the adverb discussion, is you don't need that information. What information you need with narrative are things like actions, characters doing things that, like in a movie, you would see them doing things. It would be characters, moving about, characters sitting and thinking, characters wearing things. You want to describe what things look like because it's not a visual medium. What did the building look like? What did the clothes that they're wearing look like? And my usual advice for description is describe the things which are necessary to understand the story. So this was a really frequent complaint among certain science fiction and fantasy authors like Robert Jordan, is that he would describe all of their clothes to a minute detail, though their clothes were not remotely relevant for the scene or the story as a whole. Whereas in earlier books in the Wheel of Time, so he would do that in later books. In earlier books, he would describe those things, and because we'd never met those people before, we'd never been to that land before, they're somewhat relevant. Like that the Shinarans had like a top knot, like samurai or whatever. You know, that stuff matters because they're foreign, they're different, right? But we don't need to describe it 100 times every time we see them, or like how their jackets look. Like that stuff just doesn't end up being relevant. So less is more for me is usually the rule of thumb for prose. Now, anyone who's read my books will be like, I don't think you follow that rule. And I don't. Well, I call it a rule of thumb because, believe it or not, I would write a lot more prose than I do write. But I kind of figured this out earlier on in my writing career that readers skip prose. This is a truth that a lot of authors don't want to admit because they want to write fluid, beautiful descriptions of things that readers are just going to go like straight to the next piece of dialogue and skip all that beautiful prose that you spent all that time working on. So the prose ought to be essential, especially if you don't want people to skip the prose. It needs to be describing essential things. And if it's not, well, maybe you need to cut it. But there's more to it than that. So let me get into some, before I get into the technical aspects of writing prose, like different tenses and things like that. Let's talk about, again, your genre and your audience. Actually, before I talk about that, I'll check out the chat. Thank you for the super chat, Sound Engraver. I appreciate it. Good evening. Hope you're doing well. I am doing pretty well, I would say. Rainy, gloomy days. And it's been actually kind of cool here in East Texas rather than very, very hot. The rain was kind of a cool, gentle rain, like what we would get in the valley in California. You can't have like big torrential rainstorms because you're in a rain shadow. So it felt good. Hardwick Bentho says, Robert E. Howard was able to write in a way that was fairly compact, but also elegant and descriptive. Max Allan Collins can do it that way as well. Yeah, Robert E. Howard, I think, is a really good one to shoot for. His descriptions packed a lot of punch, and anytime you were reading prose by him, you had this idea that you were reading something important, that like you needed to know about the story or something like that. It really, it packed a punch, and it felt more elaborate than its presentation. And he would do things where he would pick out specific details to talk about in his story and just talk about that one detail and not really mention all the other details. All the other details, you didn't really need them. You needed that flavor detail, like the fact that the pillars had like a snake head or something on them. That's what mattered. The rest of the hall, maybe that he was describing, wouldn't matter, so he left that out. Or he would say things directly in prose that kind of hinted at the lore that was behind some of the stories of Cole and Conan in particular. And of course, he wrote Conan and Cole differently than he wrote Solomon Kane. Those stories were written differently for the same audience, but describing different things that required different amounts of description. A fantasy story versus still in the realm of fantasy, but describing things that the reader's probably more familiar with because they're not as far back in time, more modern European settings and American settings. So it's not as far out with Solomon Kane, I guess is my point. Thinking about Solomon Kane. So it's a little bit different. And so thinking about what your story needs as far as prose is very important, as well as thinking about what the audience wants for the prose. So just to give you an example, when people are reading so-called literary fiction, one of my favorite terms, like, this is literature. What the hell else are these other books? Well, this is literary fiction. That's genre fiction, right? That's pulp. We write things that come out in hardbacks. Like now pulp comes out in hardback. I'm like, well, I don't know. It's literary fiction. That's what it is. Literary fiction. Okay. People pick up literary fiction because they want to read certain kinds of technical writing. And that includes prose that's written in a certain way. So if you are into writing advanced prose, chances are you're into reading modern literature, which means if you're writing for that audience, then they will probably read it. Bad news for you, though, there's not much of a market for literary fiction. Most of the market is what I call a phantom market. You have a book published and it goes to lots of bookstores, no one buys it, and then the books get thrown into the shredder or burned. And then the publishing company writes it off at a loss, and you get to say that you got your book published, but you maybe sold 20 copies, right? 20 copies spread across like hundreds of bookstores. That's pretty bad, but it happens so much, right? It happens a lot, and it's been happening a lot for a long time. But anyway, that's literary fiction. So yeah, that audience is going to tolerate prose more, and indeed they're going to want more complicated prose. A fantasy audience will definitely tolerate more complicated prose, especially with the influence of certain writers like J.R.R. Tolkien or Stephen R. Donaldson or Poul Anderson, guys who tend to do more description rather than just kind of hammering out a pulp-style fantasy story like what you got in the first half of the 20th century. That was really about banging out the plot. So, audiences tend to tolerate that. However, in my experience, fantasy audiences tend to just want the story, and a lot of modern audiences want the world building aspect of it for whatever reason. It's not like a bad or good thing. It's simply, what it is. So if your prose is not working on the characters or the setting or the plot, chances are it needs to be cut down a little bit. Science fiction readers tend to not tolerate prose all that well, believe it or not, unless the prose is like really specifically describing something that they care about with the story and the setting. They don't want a lot of florid, talking about this or that thing. That's just my experience. They kind of get to the point, people. And if you're getting down into romance and like young adult fiction and things like that, the prose needs to be simple, straightforward, and functional. Otherwise, readers are going to skip it. They're going to skip to the parts that seem interesting. They're not going to care about your description of the grass or the hill or like the beauty of the character unless you're going to do it in more concrete terms. You'll notice romance novels tend to describe beauty in concrete terms, and fantasy novels, especially something like Tolkien, somebody like Tolkien, if you're reading like the Silmarillion, they describe beauty in more abstract terms. Michael Moorcock, for instance, would describe beauty in much more abstract terms. Somebody is pale as a white flower. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they're like awful looking, or they mean beautiful, right? But they're not going to say in a romance novel, you'd say directly like she has really pale skin and dark hair. You would just describe it in a really straightforward fashion because readers want to visualize it in a more concrete way rather than some kind of abstract reference to, romantic ideals in painting or something like that. So know your audience when you're writing the prose, and that will guide a lot of how much prose you should write, what the prose should be like, et cetera, et cetera. Soundagraver says, I would write prose even if most readers didn't read it, only because I love prose. In my reading experience, lack of prose makes the story feel rushed. Now, I agree with that, and like I said, I tend to write a lot of prose. What did Elmore Leonard call it? Hoop-de-doodle. So hoop-de-doodle is, overly fussy prose writing. And he's like, you got to be real. Most readers skip it. Do I read the Hoop-de-doodle? And his answer was like, yes, I always read it because I love the writer. And part of loving the writer is not just loving the characters of the story, but the way the writer tells the story. And I'm in that camp as well. So, people are surprised sometimes that I like Stephen King. And I'm like, well, he's written a lot of books that I enjoy. And I like his writing style, even if I don't always like the way that he finishes stories. And it's like, oh, okay. But he said all these bad things in Twitter. I'm like, I don't really care about that. But, he's just a baby boomer on Twitter. He's going to say dumb stuff. Sorry, that's how it is. But yeah, a lot of people get attached to characters. There's people who only like The Stand by Stephen King. And if he died in 1981 or whatever, like the world would not have been diminished at all by him being missing. Or they only like the Dark Tower series. So this is a thing with a lot of modern readers, is that, and not just modern readers, especially movie watchers, they're attached to the characters and the universe and not to the writer at all. You could switch out the writer and they wouldn't care. Thus, you still have people going to see Star Wars movies, even though they're complete skin suits at this point, right? A lot of audiences, they only really care that the character exists, even though the character doesn't exist because he's freaking fictional. The character is still out there in some sense where they can have a story about the character. They care about the character being there. They don't really care about how the writer writes it. They don't care about wibbly wobbly, what was it? TIE Fighters? I'm trying to remember what he wrote. Wibbly wobbly TIE Fighters. They don't care about that. They didn't read that book. If they read it, they didn't care about the wibbly wobbly TIE Fighters. They cared that there was some character in the book that they wanted to read about. Readers skip walls of text. It's true. It's the same when characters give long-winded speeches. The funny thing is, we say that. And it's like a rule of thumb. What are the parts of Atlas Shrugged that everyone remembers and everybody reads? It's the long-winded speeches. It's John Galt talking, right? What are the parts that people remember from Shakespeare? It's the soliloquies and the monologues more than the interchanges. So we say that, but those prose passages, they often really stick out. The soliloquies often really stick out and are memorable. Dostoevsky would write soliloquies like that, have characters give these long-winded speeches, and they're probably some of the best parts of his book. So just always take my advice with a grain of salt. A lot of times I'm talking about writing genre fiction for a target audience. And the truth is your typical reader audience doesn't care about that stuff. You can include it. In fact, I do include it often. And, it's somewhat of a sorrow to me that there are so many people who read my books and don't really pick up on the thematic elements of them. Right? They're not really picking up on the deeper messages about identity and self and memory and things like that I often write about. But that's okay. If they're entertained, right? I always have an entertaining surface level story. And if nobody gets like the deeper meaning, that's okay, right? I wrote it there for people who care about it. And if people don't care about it, no big deal. Hopefully they were entertained by the plot. Hopefully the events happening led them on a jolly old journey, and they had a good time coming to the end of the story. Oh, I just missed that John Douglas was in the chat. You can read John's new book. I don't have a link to it. You could try linking it in the chat, and I'll try sending it through. So yeah, John just came out with a book a couple weeks ago. You could check it out. So yeah. Is it because as science fiction is usually more about exploring ideas and fantasy is more about immersing oneself in a different place? I would say so, right? So the science fiction stuff, you tend to explain the ideas through dialogue. Like characters explain them directly, kind of like Star Trek, rather than having like walls of text that do it. Whereas describing a beautiful verdant forest is going to require prose. Hardwick says a lot of the classic pulp writers were able to balance elegance and description with brevity. True. Lester Dent and Walter Gibson were masters of it. Yeah, Walter Gibson, he did the Shadow novels, which at least a good number of them you can read for free. He'd bang them out. What was crazy, though, is that like he didn't repeat himself. That's the real difficulty of writing at pulp speed, I think, is like not repeating yourself. Not getting sucked into doing the same thing over and over again, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Because I believe that we have a tendency to kind of fall back on the things we know. I know I do it with like guitar playing. If I'm improvising, I find I'm like, you know what? I've played that lick just too many times. I've played that little arpeggio figure just too many times at too many keys. I don't like to hear it coming out of my instrument anymore. Right? But if I was doing it less often, I probably wouldn't get as upset about like certain arpeggios that I play, certain little scale figures that I tend to throw in because I know I can execute them, or I just am not just kind of in the moment and just doing the things I know how to do. That's always my fear when I'm improvising, is like that I'm going to repeat myself, the wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey. I'm trying to remember what the whole thing was. I'm going to turn on the fan because my computer's getting this room really hot, as is this lava lamp. Give me just a sec. Even though it's winter and it's cold, my family tends to leave the heat on. It gets warm. Well, I love Tolkien. I love how C.S. Lewis describes things in a very succinct way. Ray Bradbury has to be the best at describing in his prose. It works the senses. Yes, so we'll talk about this in a minute, which is like books are a multi-sensory experience, and you should consider them as such, right? You should evoke the sense of smell, taste, sound, the feeling of air rushing over your sweaty scalp, things like that. There's a lot of different senses you can evoke in prose that aren't there in a movie or a play or a comic or some other medium, you know. I mean, you could do it in comics, but it's more difficult. It's more difficult to do it. You have to have the characters react. You have to show the characters reacting somehow. I won't start in on the Star Wars stuff this time. I'll just keep it all bottled up inside. Where I practice prose is with the characters' interiority more than the world itself. Yeah. I think deeper still means something even if a person doesn't get it. You might not see it, but your brain does, subconscious. It hits more than you think. Plus, it binds things together. It binds what the story is about together. It gives the story an impetus, a goal, a meaning that's more than just the character's specific goals, right? Even if it's something that is really broad as like good versus evil or redemption, right? Redemption and forgiveness. These are really, you know, very well trodden themes, but they give the characters a kind of motivation and a satisfaction and conclusion to a story that means a lot. So like with Eternal Dream, a lot of it is about, how should I put this? The non-objectiveness of your memory. How memory is reality even if it's not reality, because we experience it as reality. How the self is a transient thing. The person you are now is not the person you were, and it's not the person you will be. And so when characters have transformations, sometimes that's a literal physical transformation, and they don't realize it themselves. So, you know, Helga does not realize what she's transformed into in the first Eternal Dream book. And characters don't recognize her, but she doesn't have any memory of being a different person. That's how we live our lives, you know. We live our lives in a way where we are not aware of the millions of little changes that happen to our body and our time until, like, you know, I'm out running around with my son and chasing him and I'm like, my ankle hurts. I'm 40 years old and my ankle hurts, right? So I'm not used to, that joint feels a little stressed. Maybe I'm getting old, right? Maybe it's starting to break down a little bit. I never noticed it until the pain said, wait a minute, you know, this is bending a bit more than we're used to right here, even though I exercise a lot. And Walter Gibson had a lot of experience to draw upon. He'd been a Pinkerton detective and personally knew Houdini. They even used to go around debunking phony physics together. Houdini is quite a character as well. Houdini's not about magic, right? Houdini is about like the deception of it and like pushing human limits. Houdini's a really cool character all on his own too. All right, so let's talk about the different kinds of prose. We're going to start with the perspective, right? First person, second person, third person. These are the three kinds of persons. Yes, there's a second person perspective, and I use it. Let me find the book. So you can see the cover and therefore buy the book. I don't think it's this month's free book. I think Deep Time is this month's free book on Patreon. I'm talking about Afterglow. Let me grab it. Here somewhere. Here's Y Signal by J.D. Cowan. Also cool Gen Y book. This is not the book. This is Al Shafal, the fantasy book I wrote, knowing very few people would buy it. And that's part of it, is like the deeper themes about it. I'm like, well, I can't like make this into a pop story, so well, I don't know where that is. Afterglow, Generation Y. I use second person perspective, but anyway, first person perspective. What's first person perspective? That is In the prose, you're saying, I did this, I thought this, I felt this. All right, so it is a narrator who is usually a character in the book writing about their experiences as they experience them, just like how you would tell a story to another person about your personal experiences. This is it's probably the favorite perspective among mystery writers and those who are using mystery plots, because it allows you to control what details are being focused on by the reader, because whatever the narrator focuses on and talks about is what the reader focuses on. So it allows you to kind of obscure some details and focus more intently on others to make the mystery a little bit more effective. So if you're wondering why so many mysteries are written in first person, it's because it really allows you to control the flow of details. Or in third person, if there's an important detail, you really have to point it out, even if the characters are not going to focus on it, which means that there can sometimes be an incongruency between what the characters are experiencing and thinking about and what the narrator is showing to the audience. So first person. Second person is you did this, you felt this, you thought this. Now, second person, it's like you almost never read anything in second person, but I've written in second person. It's not something that you have to avoid, but you have to know what the hell you're doing with it and why on earth anyone would want to write in second person, because it feels very weird. What do you mean I did this? You can't tell me what I did and what I felt. But what we're really doing is we're taking you out of your body and mind and putting you into the experiences of another person's body and mind, and basically asking you to experience something in a first-person perspective. The reader is the first-person perspective rather than me, the first-person perspective, talking to the reader. The reader, it's like the reader is writing the story. It's like the reader is telling the story. Now, this actually has a hypnotic effect. So this is when you should use second person, is when you want to give the reader a hypnotic effect. You'll notice that scripts for hypnosis are written in second person. You lie down, you feel the ocean, you feel the sand in your toes, you don't want to smoke, you're perfectly content throwing the cigarettes in the trash, whatever the hypnosis is going to be. So hypnotists use second person for this reason, is that it is asking the person who's listening, or in this case, the person who's reading, to convince themselves and to experience what you want them to experience. It's part of, you may have heard this from hypnotists. People hypnotize themselves. You can't hypnotize a person who doesn't want to be hypnotized. That is, they have to want the experience that you're offering them, and your methods and your repetition, that is convincing them to experience what you're asking them to experience firsthand and to implant it as a real feeling and a real memory. Having it in that second person perspective is very important for the effect of hypnosis. So when should you use second person? If you read some of my stuff in Afterglow, that's when you should use second person. So I've used second person like you walk in the door, you put your backpack down, you pet the cat, you ignore the dishes, you sit on the couch, you turn on the PlayStation. So for someone who has experienced that before, this immediately evokes memories of things that they did in like 1999. They went home from school. It was hot outside. It's cold inside your air-conditioned home. Of course, I went to high school in the Central Valley in California, where it's very hot. Pretty much anything between March and November, it's hot outside, right? So most school days are hot. The same thing like in Texas. So you get home, the air conditioner feels good. You turn on your big tube TV, you wait for it to warm up. You start up the PlayStation, you hear that sound, and then you start playing a game. And that's your afternoon, and that's part of like the Gen Y experience. And if you haven't experienced that, then you get a feeling like, oh, this is something different than my normal experience. Because what's your normal experience coming home from school? You come home like a Gen Z person is going to come home, sit on the couch, look at their phone, maybe. Look at their phone. Maybe not even turn on the TV, watch Netflix. Maybe they don't get home until 6 o'clock at night. Whereas like my generation, we had a lot of latchkey kids. And the latchkey kids would you know, we would just go home after school. I remember walking home with my friends, and they'd kind of trail off, and then eventually I get to my house. I could do whatever I wanted in the afternoon if I didn't have like an after school activity going on. And that was pretty standard. Like, parents weren't home, kids went home by themselves. Even in elementary school, kids would go home by themselves. And you didn't have anything to do necessarily. There was no one telling you what to do. And there was also, nothing pressing that you had to do either. There was time to do homework later, I guess, goof off, turn on my PC, play a game of Doom or something. There's no one calling you. There's no one texting you. If you wanted to message with someone, you had to turn on your PC and sit at it and load up ICQ and maybe send an ICQ message to like your buddy who you're like, why are we doing this, man? Let's just go to the park and hang out or something, Just call each other up. You had a second phone line for the internet, and it ran at 56K baud. That was a fast modem back then. Anyway, so that's when I used second person. You do this. It's to ask the reader to experience that for themselves and to imagine themselves experiencing it. So it has a more somnial feel, a more hypnotic feel, a higher impact feel for sensory information that you're trying to give to the audience. Why don't we tell every story in second person? Well, because stories are usually about characters, whereas these little aphorisms that I'm talking about are not about characters, but about experiences. So second person is appropriate if you're writing about an experience. It's not appropriate for most stories because you're writing about a character. Saying you do this and you do that and you feel that, right, with a character that is not that person is not, it's not very congruent for most readers. Most readers are not going to like it. So that's why we don't usually write in the second person. It's not that it's wrong. I mean, you could try it as an experiment, and maybe I will someday, is like, let me write like a full-size story. I don't know, like at least a novella in second person and see what people think about. See what they think of it. And I'll have a real character. Like the character could be, like a drug addict or something. And it's like, does the person who reads it feel like a drug addict afterwards? Like, what do they feel? I don't know. So that's second person. Third person is the most common, and there's reasons that it's the most common. Third person is like you're writing from an invisible observer observing the scene. And there are two kinds of third person that you're going to see. Third person omniscient, or third person objective, right? Which is that the third person is aware of all the things happening in the scene. And we can actually make a division between those two, I think. So like omniscient would be aware of everything that's going on in the scene and what everyone is thinking. Whereas objective would be we're aware of all the things in the scene, but not what everyone is thinking. And then finally, third person personal, which is we are aware of everything that's visible in the scene that a particular character can sense. And we know of a particular character's thoughts, but the knowledge of the narrator doesn't extend beyond that. So a third person personal perspective would be like what most modern fiction is written in. Like if you're reading Game of Thrones, for example. Game of Thrones will hop between the third person personal perspective of a bunch of different characters. Here's Ned Stark. Here is Jaime Lannister, or, actually, I think we get more Tyrion Lannister in that first book, at least. Here's Tyrion Lannister. Here is, here's Ned's wife, and here's this other character, right? So here's Jon Snow's thing, and it'll just be, instead of a bunch of chapters, it just lists who the perspective is. So when it's from Jon Snow's perspective, we really only get Jon Snow's perception of what's happening. Our perception is limited to what Jon Snow is feeling. Now, he could have written it as Jon Snow first person, but third person has some particular advantages. The big one being that you can kill people. There's a little bit of a dissonance that would happen if you are writing in the third person, or first person, I mean, and then I felt the arrow enter my heart and then I died. How the hell did you write this? If you're dead. And the answer is they didn't write it. So third person, you can kill people off. even if you keep the perspective somewhat limited to what you happen to be doing, right? So that is the advantage of all the different third persons. Omniscient, a great example of really third person omniscient is something like James Clavell's Shogun. He does head hopping, which is very unpopular now, and most editors might tell you not to do it, but James Clavell did it. So generally, any piece of advice I give, you're going to find some great example of somebody who did that exact thing and made it really, really good. So James Clavell would head hop. You would have this guy, he would say something, and then he would think it. He would think something else. And then the next guy would say something, and then that next guy would think something else. Why was James Clavell doing that? Well, that was part of the atmosphere of feudal Japan that he was writing about, is that people would say one thing and think another. They would plan one thing and outwardly say they're planning something different. There were layers upon layers of intention and action, and these things were really separated from thought. So if you ever read James Clavell's Shogun, which is a very good book, though you could read my samurai novel, Muramasa Blood Drinker, which I'm rather fond of. Anyway, it's very well done with this, and you'd probably enjoy it. But if you're a modern reader and you read mostly modern fantasy books or modern historical fiction, it's going to be a little bit weird to do all the head hopping. He's totally omniscient, and he can clue you into things that even none of the characters might know, right? That's truly like an omniscient perspective. Another really popular one would be Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings follows the characters around, but is mostly in an omniscient perspective, and Tolkien will kind of break certain narrative rules and tell you a little bit about the future just offhand. You know, it's like, well, we'll see whether he gained anything in the end, right? With The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It's a thing where the narrator kind of steps out and tells you something about the story or about the characters. So he would do that a lot. So yeah, most fiction tends to be written in third person because it gives you the most options for what you're going to do. It gives you the best set of options for controlling what details are going to be presented to the reader, and for allowing in as many details as you want to give without having to focus them on a subject, right? So, I just wrote a scene where some characters are like at this ancient building. So I just can describe the ancient building in detail because it's in third person perspective. If it's in first person, you have to describe what the first person character is seeing and feeling. Whereas I just want to describe the thing directly. I want you, the reader, to know what it looks like. Every character there might have a different impact, and I have characters react maybe in different ways to the sight of this building. But the building is what it is, and I want to describe it as what it is. Whereas in the first person perspective, we're only going to describe the things that person sees and the things that person feels about it, and their observations about what other characters might feel about it. So the way you unfold the details is a little bit different in first person perspective. Like, I saw this ancient building covered in vines and it looked like crap, or like it looked really beautiful, but I couldn't tell you why. Whereas in the third person, I can tell you why it's beautiful, right? I can just describe it directly, and even indirectly, I can use a lot more creative similes in third person than I can in first person. So if you're writing things like epic fantasy, chances are you're going to want to use third person. You can use first person as well. Glenn Cook has done it. Lots of fantasy writers have written stuff in first person. It just depends how you want the story to feel. Do you want it to be really located on one character's kind of subjective experience, or do you want more details that are available than that? That's going to really determine, how you want to write the story. The other thing you have to think about is tense, right? We have past tense, present tense, and future tense. Past tense, this happened. Present tense, this is happening, which is an interesting way for me to put it compared to how you would actually write present tense. But then future tense, this will happen. So when you're writing in past tense, he went to the window and he looked out upon a strange landscape. Present tense, he goes to the window and looks out upon a strange. That feels different, doesn't it? feels really different. I don't like present tense in most narrative writing. For most prose, I really dislike present tense, right? The dialogue is the same though in present tense because the characters are always speaking in present tense. What do you see? She says, versus what do you see? She said. The dialogue is the same. It's the prose that has a different feeling. I think was it the Hunger Games? I think it was the Hunger Games that was written in present tense, which is just a weird feeling. Now it works. I think it works for really young readers. Young readers first learn present tense. We clap, we dance, we sing, he jumps, he fights, whatever. And then we add the past tense in later. But when we are hearing someone telling a story, like if I tell you a story, I'm always in the past tense. Sometimes I can hop into the present tense. I go over here, I ask this guy, what the hell are you doing here on my property? At this point, the guy turns to me and I realize that he's only got one eye. So in practice, we jump between the tenses quite a bit. And there are other languages that tend to fluidly mix tenses. They mix present and past tense. Japanese is one. So if you're not familiar with the way, certain Japanese idioms, it can be confusing because they will kind of switch tenses as they are going in the way that they describe things. And we do it in our normal conversational English all the time, but in a formal book, you wouldn't want to do that because it's confusing. And one of the main rules that you generally don't want to break is that you don't want to confuse readers. If your reader is confused, you've probably messed up along the way for like 99% of genre writing. If you're intentionally trying to confuse the reader, that's different. That's more of a postmodern kind of approach or intent. For most genre fiction, you're not wanting to confuse the reader. You're wanting to clearly communicate whatever the story happens to be. So switching tenses, you wouldn't do that. And likewise, you probably wouldn't use present tense very much. Present tense is what you are probably going to use if you're writing in second person, because you're trying to give the person the experience. You're trying to put them into the experience. You go over here, you put the book down, you do this, right? So the person's almost trying to experience, you're trying to get them to imagine it live, like I'm imagining those sequences. Versus you went over here, you put the book down, it wasn't a bright day, it wasn't a dark day. So you closed the blinds, you turned on the TV. It's like, that has a different feel than you turn on the TV. You do this. It's hypnotic when you put it in the present tense. Second person present tense is what you use for hypnosis. So if you're wanting that effect, you can use that in your book or your story. But a lot of readers may get turned off by something like second person and present tense in the third person. He does this, he does that. That reads like a movie script. So if you're ever writing a movie script, all of the directions are in present tense. Because you're not filming them, you're describing what is going to happen in the film, like the action of the film. That's what you're actually trying to communicate. It doesn't really matter that it's in a different tense or something like that. Versus telling a story, you're almost always in the real world telling it in past tense. I did this, I did that, or he did this and he did that. Because it already happened. That's how you're able to tell the story, is it already happened. It's not happening right now. Trying to put it in the present tense where it's happening right now lends a weird feeling in prose. Whereas it makes sense in a script because it's trying to evoke the feeling of the visual experience. He goes over to the window and opens it. Bill, this landscape looks strange. Whatever it happens to be. Let's take a look at the chat a little bit, and then we'll do maybe some live writing just as an example. We'll come up with the scene, pepper it with some dialogue, and put in some prose as an example for a couple of different prose styles and how you might want to use them. I often talk about the audience because knowing what your audience expects and wants from you is going to have an effect on what kind of prose you may want to write or not write. Or if you're in the case of me, it doesn't have an effect because I will sometimes write books that I actually don't care whether people read or not. I just want the book to exist. Like I would like it if people read Alshafalda, this weird fantasy book. But even when I was writing it, I was like, nah, no one's going to read this. This is way too outside the norms of the genre. Like it's not gonna be a thing. That's fine. That I ultimately I tend to write the things that I actually care about writing, in the way that I want to write them, the way that excites me, and the way that I think is an effective way to tell a story that's unique. And yeah, I don't try to trend chase. I don't try to write to market very much, but I am aware of like what kind of audience in general I would have when I am going to write prose, and it's usually a good idea if you're trying to sell a few books. Hello to all my buds. Thanks. Hopping likewise. All right. We did not have a second phone line or DSL until maybe 07. It was a real PETA. A pain in the ass. Yeah, we didn't have a second phone line for me growing up. I didn't have high-speed internet until probably 2005. And I got high-speed internet. I mean, we had it at the university, right? But I lived across from the university, and we used a complex set of Wi-Fi antennas to basically use the school's T3 line or whatever for free. So that was our high-speed internet, as we actually piggybacked on the school's Wi-Fi, which could broadcast all the way to our apartment by using like high-gain antennas. Sounds really stupid, but we were broke and poor, so it made sense. That's what we did. Robert E. Howard used head hopping to great effect too in Conan stories. He often head hopped in fight scenes. Yeah, it's a little out of style now, but that doesn't mean that it's not effective or that great authors did not use it. All right. Would you say that it's a dumb idea in this day and age to try and write in an older style, the Odyssey or Beowulf, in order to stand out from all the other modern fantasy novels and evoke an older feeling? These are great stories that set the imagination on fire, but extremely light on details. So I can't say yay or nay, because it might stand out, but it might stand out in a way that is bad, right? You can stand out in a way that's good, or you can stand out in a way that's bad. If you stand out, so if you're writing it to a fantasy audience and you're writing a alliterative verse like what Beowulf was written in, even if you're writing it in English. Now, I have alliterative verse in my books in places. I like alliterative verse. No one uses it. And when you hear it in Anglo-Saxon or in Old Norse or something like that, like if you're hearing someone recite the Volsunga or whatever, it gives a very, very different effect than regular poetry. Do I expect that? If I were to do that, would I expect to sell anything? I would not expect to sell anything unless I already had like a huge brand behind me, right? If I already had a lot of success I was building, like I could write it now and at least a couple people would read it, right? I have a big enough audience that a few people might read it, but I don't think it would build my audience. But I might do it anyway because I just think it's cool, because that's just who I am. I do things because I think they're cool, not because I want to, because I have some complex business strategy of attracting readers and something like that, right? I'm not into like the Kindle guru people who are constantly changing what they have to say every 6 months because Amazon changes the way it does business and the audience changes and this genre's out and this genre's in and you got to use keywords like this now instead of this other way. Like I don't chase any of that stuff. I kind of do it the old fashioned way. I write cool books that I think are cool and try to connect them with readers that will hopefully like them. And you know what? If no one reads it, then that's fine. I can do a lot of things. Like there's the 20 books to 50K crowd. If you write 20 books and you do them in this exact way in a series, blah, 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 I'm like, I don't want to do that for $50,000 because like I could go make more than $50,000 teaching and it's probably less work than writing 20 books. In fact, a lot less work than writing 20 books. And that's because I'm an experienced teacher and I know what I'm doing. Don't listen to the people who are like, teaching's the busiest, most time demanding, stressful job. It's like, why don't you quit? Oh, because other jobs pay less, have higher hours, and are actually worse than teaching. That's just kind of an aside I notice with a lot of teachers is that teachers that complain a lot about the job don't ever seem to leave the profession. It's because, it turns out that getting paid, this amount of money for this number of days with this amount of benefits and this low of expectation from me, I can't actually find in the private sector. That's why they don't leave their job. You find these guys, I found, I knew teachers that were like 60 years old, kind of like, shuffling their feet until retirement, talking about how bad the profession was and how much they hated the kids and how worthless they are and how bad their parents are. That was like 80% of what they talked about. I'm like, why don't you just quit? It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to earn out my retirement. You make $120,000 a year. You can't be fired. No one cares what you do because like you teach math. You can't even be replaced by anyone. And you get $11,000 extra a year to buy health insurance. Plus, you get to be in a giant pool where your health insurance costs nothing, where if you had to buy it on the open market, it'd be 5 times more expensive. And you only have to work 190 days a year. You take your entire summer off. You get 2 weeks off for Christmas. You get a whole week off for Easter. No one in the private sector gets that off. Oh, but people in the private sector have like a work-life balance. Teachers have a work-life balance if they choose to, right? Most choose not to. I should say most. Some choose not to. Some have an identity of like, I'm a teacher and that is who I am. I can't just not give the kids 150% of my effort, even though they hate me and want me dead. It's like, why, right? Like, if my kids don't want me there, I'm not really going to put that much effort. I'll do what the job requires of me. I will teach and educate, which is my job. My job is not to break my mental self or my body, for the benefit of kids who don't care. Even for the benefit of kids who do care. If they do care, I won't have to do that much. I won't have to break myself for them, right? Anyway, that's an aside. Evoke an older feeling. I think it's cool. It's a cool idea. It might stand out from the crowd. The question is whether people would actually find it readable. I think probably not. So this goes to with like book covers. Let me find, I don't have a good book cover as an example, right? I've had people try to be critical of my book covers, and my book covers are really good. And, they do what they need to do, right? Which is to signal the genre and some of the content that's in the book. And you do that with a lot of things like colors and stuff like that. And they say that without having things like, well, why didn't you write covers that are like these Japanese light novels? It's like, if you put a Japanese light novel cover on your regular novel, you will get a 1-star rating from the 3 people that buy it. No one's going to buy this book. It has to look like the other things in the genre, or people won't buy it. And if they do buy it, they'd be like, I thought this was going to be in this other thing. This product did not meet my expectations. 1 star. You're going to get a lot of 1-star reviews. Sorry, that's how it's going to happen, right? So I'm recalling this conversation where someone's like, I'm like, give me an example of a good cover. And they give like Japanese light novel stuff. I'm like, okay, I can tell that you're like 17 or something, right? But no one is going to buy my book with a Japanese light novel cover. The target audience is adults who read fantasy, not 17-year-olds who want a Japanese light novel, because this isn't that. If you pick up my book and you read it, you might have a better experience than a Japanese light novel, but you won't have a Japanese light novel experience. Right? This is not middle-aged businessmen arise in another world. This is not that. This is high fantasy. You know what I mean? There's maps and crap. But anyway, the point is like, if it's too different, people won't buy it because they think they think you're doing something else. They're like, is this a translation of something older? Why would anyone write something so hard to read? What they want is a fantasy novel written with prose. They don't want an epic poem. Most people. Neil Gaiman could do it and sell 1 million copies probably, but chances are you won't. Just how it is, unfortunately. But if you think it's cool and you want to do it, then just go ahead and do it. And the worst that can happen, especially if you don't care about making money, the worst that can happen is you don't make any money, which you didn't expect to in the first place. The best thing that could happen is you do stand out from the crowd and people are like, it's cool that he wrote this epic poem. I don't think I would attempt to write something in the style of Beowulf unless I spent like a few months at least studying that work plus all the other stuff like the Poetic Edda and all that kind of stuff. I would study that in the original languages and in, it's difficult to study, say, in Anglo-Saxon or Old English, because it's a completely different language. Not only that, but it was usually written in a different alphabet. You had like Anglo-Frisian runes. You're gonna read Anglo-Frisian runes. You're gonna jump into that lake. It's a lot of work. But I mean, I would do it if I just felt really compelled, like, I need to bring this forward into the 21st century. But some of these things are products of their time. What people wanted and were entertained by in the 9th century is not the same as what they want and are entertained by in the 21st century. We have a different culture, we don't have bards that get up with their harps and do some scalds or something. We don't have that stuff. We can have it again. It's on YouTube. In fact, I would do it, right? And I've contemplated how to do this many times. You don't realize the question you're asking. So yes, I've contemplated like doing bardic, skaldic poetry or something with like my guitar, or like get my Baroque lute out and do something with it like that. But anytime I think about doing it, I'm like, people will think it's a fun novelty, and that'll be it. No one will actually care about it, right? No one's gonna be like, oh, did you hear about this guy doing new skaldic poetry with the Baroque lute? You'd be like, no, why would I want that? I want Harry Potter. Head hopping being more common in comics. Oh, in comics, it's so easy. So head hopping in comics, every character can have his own thought bubbles. Boop, 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 boop. You just put thought bubbles everywhere. You have prose in comics. So let me actually address this a little bit. You do have prose in comics. Stan Lee used prose all the time. Every comic writer who's good will use prose. You put it in a little box. It's the box. That will give you the narrative elements. And you only want to put stuff in boxes that is information that the audience needs to know, which is not conveyed by the visuals. So the visuals give you lots of information. The dialogue gives lots of information. The thoughts, which are a form of dialogue, give lots of options. And then anything that's not covered by that, you can use prose. A lot of people don't use prose. They're like, oh, it's a comic, so I shouldn't have any narrative prose. Like, nah, you can have tons of it, right? To just give extra information to make it super clear to the reader what's going on. Stan Lee did it, therefore you can do it. Basically, if Stan Lee did it, you have a justification for doing it, right? There's this quote from On Fairy Stories that goes something like, if you like theater, you're interested in characters. If you like literature, you like things. I've yet to find out what he meant. I'm not sure. I like character. I mean, I like both. I like theater. I've done theater. I'm not like a theater kid that I make fun of, like theater kids, but like, I'm not a theater kid, but I've done theater. Performed theater in my time. I know Mill Sci-Fi has a certain style. You can be cool in it, but you have to maintain that style. Yeah, if you break away from that style, people will just close the book. So, let's look at that with military sci-fi. If you're going to write a military sci-fi book, which I suppose I've written one. I've written military fantasy. I don't know, Prophet of the Godseed. Because Prophet of the Godseed, so I realize now, not when I wrote it, I was trying to write it really hard to the genre. Now I realize it's way outside the genre. Because I did a bunch of things that just aren't typical for modern sci-fi. Anyway, there's military stuff in it. But yeah, somebody who's going to buy a military sci-fi book, they have a really firm set of expectations about what you are going to do in that. And if you don't follow up on those expectations, then they're going to close the book, and they may even decide to stop by and give you a 1-star review, which sucks. So why would you? It's like, I'm going to do military sci-fi, but I'm going to do it totally. I'm going to just switch up the style entirely. It's like, okay, that might be bad. That's like saying, I want to do death metal, but I'm going to switch it up, and I'm going to put like a bunch of rap on top of it, and I'm going to put this on. It's like, people are going to hate that, man. Like any deviation from an established style with like a long-running genre, whether it's music or anything else, usually ends up with fans hating you. And I'm not just talking about like Saint Anger, which was like objectively bad. I mean something like, what was that Morbid Angel record? Elude Divinum Insanitatis? I don't remember. Anyway, they did a bunch of like electronica stuff and like industrial metal stuff. They were known as as a death metal band. Fans hated it. I didn't think it was that bad, but it's like, why did you call this Morbid Angel, right? So if you're going to write military sci-fi and take out all the military sci-fi style, it's like, should just write in a different genre. That's what it's like. It's an unfortunate thing. It's like genres enforce their own tyranny, if you will, in terms of style. Like, you can't be a death metal band and have, I don't know, keyboards that sound like Dragon Force or something on top of it. In which case, you're no longer death metal. It's like the style is so tightly defined that you really can't step outside of it, even with like something like Production. 19th century style prose can sometimes still work today, especially if it's horror, mystery, or a romance story. I agree. I think it's great to look at 19th century styles. There's a lot there that you can look at, even stuff like Sir Walter Scott, who writes in a style that most people would just not really enjoy today. There are things about it that I think work really well. You notice 19th century books will have a tendency to be a lot heavier on prose than 20th century books, because people would just spend more time reading. They were more willing and interested in reading long parts of prose. You can read a Sir Walter Scott book, and there'll be several pages of prose describing things, and people liked that. They wanted those things painted for them. Describing a big table and like the darkness of the room and all those sorts of things. Audiences liked that stuff more than they do today. Now, I think with the acceleration, with the 20th century and the acceleration of mass media, people want, it's more fast food, right? They want faster food. They don't want food that takes a long time to make. They don't want a 7-course meal where like the courses are intended to build up in a certain way. What they want is like a burger and fries that tastes really good right now, and then I move on with my day. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's different things for different people for different moods. If you want a quick, dirty story, it's better to read Robert E. Howard than to like pick up Dickens. But if you want to sit and like read a longer story, then Charles Dickens' book is probably better. It just depends what you want. I know which one tends to be more popular, and it's like fire the plot on all cylinders until you get to the last page. That's the modern writing advice, and it's fine. It's good advice. You don't have to follow it to a T, though. Honor Harrington is military science fiction, but different than Space Marine stories. It's essentially Horatio Hornblower in space. Yeah. God, what's another one? My mind is slipping on it. The thing is like once a genre starts to develop, if you start doing things outside of it, then the audience like just gets upset that you didn't do exactly what they were expecting. They want the same meal. Like they want to go to Burger King and get a Whopper. That's kind of what genre fiction is, right? You go to Chick-fil-A, you want a chicken sandwich, so you order a chicken sandwich. You expect maybe, you don't know exactly how is this chicken sandwich going to compare to every other chicken sandwich I've had. But you know you want a chicken sandwich. You have an expectation that it's going to look, taste, feel a certain way in your mouth, leave you feeling a certain way afterwards. And when it fails to do that, then you're like, well, this is a bad chicken sandwich. It's a little bit different than like, okay, Mom, what are you cooking? Mom, what are you cooking for dinner tonight? And it's something that you didn't order and you didn't expect, and it's maybe surprising or something like that. Or you're ordering a dish you've never had before. Most people, when you're hungry, you're like, you know what, I could really go for a burger. And so you go to a burger joint, and it's a burger joint you've never been to. You're expecting the burger to be a little different, but you're expecting it to still be a hamburger at the end of the day. So getting too far away from the genre expectations just means that the audience either doesn't want the book or doesn't like the book. Even if it's good, you can write a book that is objectively a great story, like technically perfectly executed, and it can get a bunch of 1-star reviews because you marketed it to the wrong genre. You told sci-fi readers they would like it, and they didn't like it. You wrote using some of the military science fiction tropes, and you marketed it to them, but it was a romance story, and they hated that. It could have been a great romance story, but the genre limitations enforced upon you say that it's garbage, right? And it's 1 star. It's not what I wanted. Even if it's really well done, So there's the danger with that. It's like a lot of people are thinking about the business. How do I make the book? How do I sell the book? And frankly, a lot of indie authors are really motivated by money. And this is not a bad thing, right? Everybody's motivated by money. We have bills. We got to pay our bills. We got to pay our taxes, all that kind of stuff, right? So we have to do things for money. It's like a requirement of living. But I notice a lot of indie authors have this fantasy of being an author and making the money. It's like, I've written a lot of books at this point, you know. I'm waiting for this magical $1 million book to come out. So they get really focused on the business part of it. And then when you get really focused on the business part of it, you won't do anything original. You won't take any risks. You got to take some risks. So like the Beowulf thing, if that's a risk you want to take, I could tell you that I think your chances of that being really successful are going to be low. But if that's what you want to do, then do it, because no one else is doing it. No one else is going to write that for you. So you might as well do it. But yeah, they get a little indie fiction people tend to get a little focused on the business, right? Like, I want to write this and make money. But at the same time, I also want to express myself. I want to write a romance in military science fiction. It's like, it's not going to sell. You could still do it, but it's not going to sell. So just know what your intent is. Is your intent to sell a book? Is your intent to have a career as an author? Or is your intent to express yourself truly? There's different things. And you can balance the two, by the way. These things are not in competition. You can do both. But people just get a little too focused on what are the dots I need to connect to make $50,000? Go over to the 20 Books to 50K group on Facebook and ask them, and they might give you some good advice. And then you might do that and figure out that you didn't make $50,000 for all your effort. That it might have been a win more strategy. That you can make $50,000 a year after you drop $40,000 a year into advertising your book on Amazon. Things like that. Lord Raging Goblin. I was reading some Edgar Rice Burroughs recently. Good choice. Father of science fiction. Never seen Edgar Rice Burroughs mentioned. Never seen his name written or spoken aloud in a literature class in all my years. Never heard it in an English class in public school. Never heard it in any of my literature classes at the university level. Not once. I didn't know who he was until I was like, who wrote Tarzan? Who wrote Tarzan? I think I was like, I only knew who Edgar Rice Burroughs was because of Monster Magnet. Because they wrote a song about Tarzan, King of Mars. And I was like, okay, what is this? Oh, it's this guy. Oh, he wrote this other stuff like Princess of Mars. What is that? John Carter comes out and it's not called Princess of Mars. Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories are some of the most popular stories ever written. He's probably the most influential writer of all time, maybe the most influential 20th century writer. At the dawn of the 20th century, he changed genre fiction, fantasy, and science fiction forever. But you're not going to see his name mentioned because he's just too popular, I guess. Anyway, yeah, it's a good choice. Edgar Rice Burroughs. And it's funny how 100 years ago, this was considered pulp, lowbrow material for childish idiots, but his vocabulary and language is super erudite compared to the average modern person. Yes, we've refined the product more and more to the point where it literally is like McDonald's. Think about how a person may have had a sandwich 100 years ago. Bread that was made that day, that they got from the baker or they baked themselves, and then meat that they cooked right there, which they got from a butcher who butchered the cow himself, right? Got the meat fresh from Chicago and cut it up, and you bought meat from a butcher. You didn't just buy frozen hamburgers and throw them on the George Foreman. That's how I eat, by the way. But that's not, and then today you have McDonald's where it's almost like a robot makes it. Here's your hamburger, and you eat it, and you're like, that gave me nutrition on with day, tasted acceptable. yeah, we refine the product into like its barest essentials with no like human flavor to it, and then that's a lot of what. Frankly, I don't want to. This almost sounds like I don't want to. I am an indie writer, so I don't want to crap on indie fiction because the best stuff is indie fiction too. But indie fiction as a phenomenon is all about the McDonald's hamburger. Trad, old pub as a phenomenon is all about trying to get people to eat what you want them to eat when they order a hamburger. If that makes any sense. It's like indie fiction's like, we're going to sell as many hamburgers as possible. How can we make 1 billion hamburgers and sell them? Right. It's like, okay, well, I guess if you make them good, what's the precise things I need to do to make it good? I will do those exactly and no more. It's like, okay. Versus, Trad Pub is like, okay, people want McDonald's hamburgers. How do we get them to eat bat guano and sushi? It's like, you know what I mean? Man, no one's buying the bat guano. We sold 12 copies of the bat guano. The bat guano sandwich is selling 12 copies. Like most of these publishing houses would be closed if it weren't for like the back catalog of Robert Jordan or like Stephen R. Donaldson or, Glenn Cook or Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson. Like if Brandon Sanderson, I think he just keeps, is it Tor? Is he on tour? I think he just keeps the publishing house open, him and Robert Jordan. And they take all that money they make and they spend it on advances for their friends and then print 5,000 copies of the book, send them to the bookstores. No one buys them because they don't want a bat guano sandwich. And the thing about a book is you can read the first page and be like, this isn't for me. I put it back on the shelf. So they just destroy those and turn them into toilet paper. And the person never recoups the advance, but oh well. It's like a kind of a weird like embezzlement scheme almost. Yeah. Okay, hypothetical. How do I escape out of a bank vault? You rely on the X-ray vision of Superman to see you in the bank vault. You light the money on fire. You light your million. This is from an episode of Superman from like 1 million years ago. Superman sees it with his X-ray vision and comes and rescues you. So how do you escape out of a bank vault? Chances are you turn the handle and open the door. So a lot of vaults include a way to get out of them in case you are locked inside of them. Just like refrigerators. Have you ever seen like a walk-in freezer at a restaurant? You close the door and there's a pull handle on the inside. Why? What if somebody accidentally closes the door and locks it and the person is in there, right? You got to have that pull handle to get out of there, right? Asimov, Clarke, and Heinlein are supposedly the big three science fiction writers, but I consider the real big three to be Verne, Wells, and Burroughs. Yeah, it depends. So the replacement of stuff like Edgar Rice Burroughs with, Isaac Asimov, that was an intentional thing. It was part of like a top-down phenomenon. Absolutely, corporations can, by fiat, determine what tastes are. That's something that they can and they have and they will do. And so that's an example. What is more influential on our general stories today, do you think? Arthur C. Clarke or Edgar Rice Burroughs? I think Edgar Rice Burroughs is. I think he's a lot. Now, Arthur C. Clarke might be more influential on current sci-fi writers writing, but Edgar Rice Burroughs is more influential on the entire culture and the way that we tell stories by a lot. So, if you haven't ever read Edgar Rice Burroughs, it's probably worth your time to go back and read Tarzan book or two, Princess of Mars. Both of those are super, super, super influential books. So, yeah, they're fun. They're good to read. They're fun to read. I hate to say like you should read something because it's influential. It's like you can fall into that trap with music. It's like, oh, what albums should I listen to get into metal? It's like, well, what's influential? It's like, no, let's start with like what's fun to listen to. You should listen to Sonic Firestorm by Dragon Force. That's going to make you want to hear more. You're going to get blown away by that, right? Versus I'm like, oh, let me think about what's really important. Oh, you got to listen to, Sad Wings of Destiny by Judas Priest. Like, you're probably not going to like that if you're a modern listener. Maybe you might, but that's a different thing. Like, listening to understand a genre is different than listening to something which is just good, right? The Black Album by Metallica will get you into metal. It's definitely in like the bottom 50% of Metallica albums as far as I'm concerned, but it's good. It's fun to listen to, especially if you're not used to metal. So those are kind of two different things, right? I think Edgar Rice Burroughs is really fun to read. Jules Verne. I'm trying to think what's a fun one. It was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the submarine one. There's a reason they keep adapting that one, is that it's a good adventure. So, yeah. I was berated by an English teacher in high school for reading Lord of the Rings. Said it was garbage. I was like, in this day and age, why aren't you glad I'm reading? Hey, many such cases. I had an English teacher who pushed The Mists of Avalon by, what was her name? Oh, that's right. Marion Zimmer Bradley. Marion Zimmer Bradley's daughter occasionally watches this stream. And she wrote a book about her parents called The Last Closet and the terrible sexual abuse she suffered. So, at the time, people were like, this is like the feminist retelling of Arthur. As she was raping her child the whole time. There you go. That's what they push on us. We're child rapists. Moira Grayland is her name. So if you look up The Last Closet by Moira Grayland, don't read the book unless you like if it'll trigger you, like, you should know not to read that, right? Some people, that's not something they need to revisit, right? And that's fine. You don't need that. But if you want to know, you can check that one out. If one is or can study toward becoming as close a prime philologist as possible, maybe to systematize our words order according to its frequency relative to historical timeline, that would be an interesting idea. Why not just make up a new language like Esperanto? Esperanto is, there's books you can read in Esperanto. There's even a movie that William Shatner did in Esperanto. And there's like clubs that speak Esperanto. This idea like we can replace the language with one that we've designed to be better. The truth is language develops according to how we use it, and we use it in a way that we need, in the way that it suits our needs. So a organically developing system of language, which actually changes less over time than people think, right? Like, Shakespeare is still readable, however, 400 and some odd years later, right? We could still read Shakespeare and understand his words, even if we're like, he's using them a little bit differently than we're used to, right? We could still understand Shakespeare. So some of the usage has changed, some of the word orders changed, but like we still know that word means that word. Moreover, like the meaning of Shakespeare, people misunderstand this when I say this, like the meaning of words don't change. Shakespeare's meaning for what he wrote didn't change because we use words in a slightly different way now, right? Didn't mean that now Shakespeare is about this. It's like, no, that doesn't work that way, right? Language is fixed when you use it. So I mean, Esperanto is one of these great things from the 20th century that I love, because the 20th century was all about how do we do it? We can do it better, can't we? I just found out I can look at the chat on Restream, which is good. I doubt there's any chat on any other platform, but I can see the YouTube chat. I don't know if I can see if there's any other chat on any other thing. I see my bit rate is too high for Twitter. All right. Sorry, Twitter. I'm giving you too many bits. All right, where was I? 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days. That's another one that gets adapted a lot. I forgot about that one. Journey to the Center of the Earth, Mysterious Island, In Search of Castaways. All those are Jules Verne. Verne pioneered submarine space travel and Hollow Earth stories. Wells pioneered alien invasion and visibility. Yeah, H.G. Wells and time travel. He did The Time Machine. So I haven't read everything by Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, but it's good to go back and read a couple of them. I remember 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea being a fun read when I read it as a kid. I haven't read it since. But it's such a good adventure. There's like danger and so many fun things. There's a reason it gets adapted so much. I remember the Saturday Night Live skit about it. It's like, right now, we're 20,000 leagues under the sea. No, we're traveling 20,000 leagues while under the sea. Right now, we are about 200 fathoms deep. So right now, we are 20,000 leagues under the sea. Kind of funny. Ever read Chronicles of the Black Company? I have, and I do recommend it actually for people. So Black Company, and there's a whole bunch actually. There's like the Books of the North, the Books of the South. There's several trilogies that you can read in Black Company. So the first one's really good, and I do recommend it. I think it's written in first-person perspective since we're talking about prose. Let's do a little bit of live writing. I'm interacting with I love interacting with the chat, but we should do some live writing as well. Oh, let me finish my bit on 20th century and Esperanto. So the 20th century was all about, we're going to make new aesthetics and new things that we're going to design with our intellect and our science and our reason. Some of those things were things like communism. Other things were like cubism and modern art. Not popular things, right? Or 12-tone music. So most of the things, the new things that smart guys came up with in the 20th century, at least in terms of ideas, were pretty bad. Whereas the tinkerers, who just were making physical objects, came up with great things. Turns out trying to apply like some sort of machinist, some sort of mechanical, I don't know what else to call it, like materialist philosophy to human endeavors just doesn't yield very good results. But Esperanto is an example. Well, language is messy and, the rules are hard to understand. Why don't we just make a new language up that is just better right from the get-go? We'll make up a new language that is correctly ordered with all the words that we need, yada, 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 right from the get-go. Turns out people don't want to learn a new language. They want to just speak the language they know, and they don't want to lose the feeling of their language. Every language speaks a little bit to the culture that uses it. It's derived from that culture. So part of studying a new language is actually studying the culture that uses it. You can't just speak Japanese absent Japanese culture because it's used by Japanese people in Japan. Just as an example, right? Same thing with Spanish, right? If you study Spanish, you'll notice that there's like Mexican Spanish. There might be a Latin American Spanish, like how they use it in Argentina, and then there in Chile, and then there's like, Spanish from Spain, Iberian Spanish, and each of those cultures has a different way that they use the language in subtle different ways. Just like how people in England speak English a little bit different from people in the United States or Australia. Just be careful when it comes to Jules Verne editions. Most of the older public translations of his work are poorly done and bowdlerized, especially 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I might have read a bowdlerized version. I might have read censored versions because it was from 1 million years ago. Yeah. Tell that to the gun control activists who think the word well-regulated militia means how we view the words today. Something like regulated. Regulated means to make regular. That's what regulations are, to make them regular. That's actually what a regulation does. We think of it now as a rule, but a rule is not a regulation. A regulation means, okay, everything's going to be this size. That's a regulation, right? Regulation size ball. That means the ball is always the same size and shape in every football game. That's what regulation means. So rules and regulations. If regulations are rules, why do we say rules and regulations? Because regulations are actually not rules. They are things that make them regular. That's what it means. It's like the word decisive. A decisive victory is a victory which decides something. It doesn't mean an overwhelming victory. It means one which is decisive. He scored a decisive victory. That means it was important. It did something versus like a Pyrrhic victory that did nothing or was like not worth the cost. Yeah, Hardwick pointed out to me like that they rewrote all the Hardy Boys books. Like starting in, I don't know, 60s or 70s, they bowdlerized them. They rewrote them into just different stories. Footprints Under the Window, which I have the original edition of from 1929 or 27 or whatever, it is just a different book from the Footprints Under the Window that you would buy today in a bookstore. Really wild to think about that kind of thing. But it happens, right? You just erase the books and replace them with different books, building on the Hardy Boys name that has existed for 100 years. Maybe they'll bowdlerize them again. We'll replace Footprints Under the Window with a third different book that no longer has the word Chinaman in it. Or Oriental or something like that, whatever people find offensive now. All right, let's do a little bit of live writing. I'm going to figure out how to set this up real quick. I'm going to open up a Word document and blank document. Boop, boop, boop. Let's find something that will show this in kind of the size that I want to show it. Kind of want it like big here, but there we go. Maybe I can move this over like that. Tell I need to get some more potassium. I'm getting like one of those little hand twitches. Twitch, 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 twitch. Weird. I think it's like a potassium deficiency. All right. So here we go. Let's write something. I think we can see the whole page there. All right. Ironically, the original versions of the Hardy Boys books may overtake the revised editions of popularity because they're going to be in the public domain. Dover has republished the first two. Interesting. Did you ever play Metal Gear Solid 5? It's about a virus that targeted and spread via a specific language. The villain said you can damage a country more by taking away their language than anything. I played like the first part of Metal Gear Solid 5, but then I didn't finish it. I bought the digital version of it on sale years ago and never really played it. And I was like, I didn't play Metal Gear Solid 4, so I need to go back and play that one and finish that one. And I didn't do that either. And that one's locked on the PS3. It's one of those games that's like, not lost, but kind of stuck on a outdated console. That's weird, I know I'd be pissed if someone referred to me as an America man. I'm an America man. How are you? I'm from America. I'm an America man. All right, let's write some prose. Let's size it up here a bit so we can really see what's going on. So we'll write some dialogue. What kind of scene do we want? Let's write a fantasy. We'll write a fantasy scene. Okay. And we'll explore a couple of different effects. I walk down the gallery, observing more in my peripheral vision let's think of a good word, the perverse decorations of the palace. Each painting a twisted, carnal gesture toward the obscene. Each statue a writhing moment of lust, frozen in time. I must admit, my gaze was drawn away from the end of the hallway and the slim haunting figure that led me. Gaze was at times figure that led me. Fate would be decided. All right, so here's a paragraph. Let me see how this looks. Oh, the stream's like, I'm way behind. Let me catch up. There we go. Okay. It looks good. Looks good. All right. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. In fact, I can maybe size it up a bit. We'll make it like 18 so we can really see it. Really see the words good. Okay. So here's an example. This is in the first person perspective. Notice that what we are focusing on in the first person perspective is what the narrator has experienced. It's in past tense. I walked versus I walk. Present tense would be a little weird, right? And we don't need present tense first person. So we're just not going to do that because I think it's very awkward. If we turn it into first person, present tense, it'd sound like this. I walked down the gallery, observing more of my peripheral vision, the perverse decorations of the palace. This sentence wouldn't make sense because you wouldn't have all that extra information if you're doing it in present tense. I must admit, this is actually present tense, right? I must admit my gaze was, but we're still talking about the past. At times drawn away from the end of the hallway to the slim, haunting figure that led me to where my fate would be decided. All right, we don't know too much about the slim, haunting figure, right? We're mostly focusing on what the first person perspective there is focusing on, which is these pornographic paintings that I'm imagining. From this, we can gather a couple of interesting things, right? This person they've never been to this palace before. They're calling them perverse, which means that they may be from a foreign land, and we may be dealing with some kind of very strange, like maybe even an evil figure as we go down the gallery. Wait here, the hooded man said, as we reached a large set of oaken doors carved in shapes that defied my fragile sense of reality, already diminished in the strange place. So we're going to evoke some H.P. Lovecraft here with this. Missed the two. Doesn't matter. Right. You missed the two in the last sentence between hallway and the slim. Nope, I did not. The slim haunting figure is leading me down the hallway, so there's no two there. I must admit my gaze was at times drawn away from the end of the hallway, the slim haunting figure that led into the hallway, the slim, I am missing a word, but it's not two. From the end of the hallway that the slim haunting figure led me toward. I'm going to say a place where my fate would be decided, right? Okay, I'm writing this live. This is a little better sentence. I do this a lot sometimes, is like I recompose it. And I attack it. All right, we're gonna add some more flavor there. Okay. So we got this. of their own accord, as if one of the doors swung silently inward. I caught a glimpse of the room beyond, and my heart quickened. A cool breeze, we're going to add some extra senses here. A cool breeze escaped from the portal and chilled the sweat that was collecting on my head and neck, which I had until that point been unaware of. Right. So we don't just want visuals, like we want, how does he feel about him? He feels that they're like evoking, they're powerful, right? And then we have another sense here, the feeling of air, right? You have more than five senses. So the feeling of air feels really good here. Okay. I could make out a circular space with a single sickly green light source at its center for the door closed. For a few moments, I considered running back down gallery. Futile attempt to escape. But more by the will in the next room than my fear of the, let's think of a cool word here, the gargantuan, inhuman guard. I stood still, waiting as the hooded man had bidden. I'm going to save this real quick. So always save your work early and often. All right, we can't see where we're typing now. Okay, thank you. Let us resize it a bit. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so now we can see this. This is about 235 words. Half a page, right? So we wrote half a page. Not bad. Okay, I don't know if we want to write any dialogue, because I did want to talk about dialogue from last week. So let's do that. Let's have the door open, and we'll go in and we're going to meet like a Dark Lord or something, okay? Again, silently, the door opened. My guide was gone, and indeed I could not see who had opened the door. If they existed and were not a phantom, they were lost totally in the shadows that clung to the outer wall of the circular space. There was not much else. So I did. I'm going to change the view. This isn't page view, but let's do, what is this, vertical? No. I don't know. I always write in print layout, so it's kind of weird for me to like even think of switching out of print layout for anything. You know, here, let me make this just very slightly bigger. So like we can, so we can see a little bit more of the page here. There we go. Okay, we can see a little bit more of the page. Let's do some dialogue, and we'll talk about some dialogue tags. Let's think of something the Dark Lord would say. Let me check the chat. You guys always have good ideas. I can only, okay. Someone visited by the creative muse today. This is how I write every day, man. This is normal shit to me. The last few years have given me an intense dislike of the word they used as a singular. It's actually historically correct. I found that out, that it's been used lots, right? So I did. Let me think of what the Dark Lord's going to say. Mine's Din. Voice was Stark. I knew lit by there we go. Perhaps it was from the a reflection from the dome high above the dais. Clad in, I'm not going to say oxidized because it wouldn't make sense in this context. Tarnished copper. I don't think putrescent is a word, but I'm going to use it. Yeah, there we go. I don't think putrescent's a word, but I'm going to use it. The horror that sat upon the throne. I want to say throne on the dais, but like it's like a lot of on. The throne. springing up from the dais. Maybe I listen to a lot of death metal, the putrescent, right? Eaten back to life. Tomb of the Mutilated. Love death metal stuff. All right. Springing up from the dais. Okay. His eyes were human. Or else were made wet and vital by some glamour beyond my ken. The rest of him had the appearance of a rotting corpse. Or perhaps it was that he was so aged and so wizened by his magic, that it pressed upon me the aura of death. Deep creases disturbed a face that ought to have been human, making it more like melted wax. For something alien or demonic. I wrote more than I intended to write, like one paragraph, but I'm like, I want to get to some dialogue. I do as you bid, my lord. Words came out sounding far less frightened than I felt. Good. Creature upon the throne. Now he doesn't have a name yet. Like, we should give him. I don't have any names, right? I'm just like focusing on what the prose is going to tell us about this. We actually have a lot of information packed in here. This is basically an info dump, right? Did you start Eyes in the Walls on a test stream? Is this the next book? This could be. Why not? If people like it. Yeah, I started Eyes of the Walls on a Halloween stream, and then I published it on like December 1st or something. I wrote it and then I published it. So yeah, this could be this. I'm almost out of time though. All right. So notice a couple of things I did here. I do as you bid, my lord. The words came out sounding far less frightened than I felt. So we're indicating that this dialogue was said by the narrator, right? And we're not saying I said. Good, said the creature upon the throne. So we have a said there. We haven't had the word said here. How lightly you walk into the lion's den. Then I described the voice. The voice was stark and dry, high and brittle, and yet omnipresent. I knew that it came from the dais at the center of the immense structure, lit by those strange ochre lamps I had seen before. Or perhaps it was reflection from the dome high above the dais, which appeared to be clad in tarnished copper that, to my eyes, seemed putrescent. Like putrid. I stepped forward and my eyes adjusted. Then it was indeed by his will and not mine that I moved, for I then beheld the horror that sat upon the throne springing up from the dais. His eyes were human, or else were made wet and vital by some glamour beyond my ken, but the rest of him had the appearance of a rotting corpse. Or perhaps it was that he was so aged and so wizened by his magic that it impressed upon me the aura of death. Deep creases disturbed a face that ought to have been human, making it more like melted wax over something alien or demonic. I do as you bid, my lord. The words came out sounding far less frightened than I felt. Good, said the creature upon the throne. A great, gnarled hand clicked heavy golden rings as it reached down and opened a chest that sat in the Dark Lord's lap. You are wise to obey. What's his name going to be? Xander? I like the name Xander. That's a cool name, man. I like X's. You are wise to obey, Xander. John. I could do John. We're just going to use Xander. We could come up with like a cooler fantasy name. I hate fantasy names that are like, Vothe. Like, how do I say that, man? Xander's a name I know, even though X is not something that you would usually use. And we could replace it with something that's really easy, like, I like Xander. We're going to keep Xander for now. I crept closer and looked into the chest. It was brimming with jewels and gold. They covered something else that was sinister. Something moving subtly beneath the riches. Sorry, you probably can't see this. There we go. Murdragorth. Murdragorth. That's a good one. Sounds like a bad guy. So we make that the Dark Lord. I'm just going to call him Murdrag. Murdrag. His satin-covered lap. The crackling voice. I looked up at his face and detected a sardonic smile. My payment? He nodded. Enough for a man like you. What else? He laughed, and my blood ran cold. A bead of sweat fell from my nose. And at that moment, I noticed the smell, which, matching the unholy light, was equally insalubrious. Right, there's a lot of hoop-de-doodle in this prose. Okay. Equally insalubrious. It was from the Dark Lord, or from the box. I did not know. Though I guess it was from both. On the one hand, the rot of the man who held the box. On the other, the thing inside. I have many methods. Both ancient and how does she live? I don't know if I'm going to put this in my... Should I put this in my universe? I don't know if I should. I'll do it for now. She lives and will live, but the ritual will only... I stared at the closed box for a minute in horror and wonder. I did not realize at first that, what did I call him? Murdrag. It's called Murdrag. Right. It moved. He was now standing tall over me. Yeah, he was now standing tall over me. We don't have to go into like details of that. He's really tall. And held forth a sheathed knife with an ebon handle, glittering with copper details. I took it and drew it out a finger width. The blade was no less black than the handle. And though it had the subtle sheen of malachite, I knew it would be deadly sharp. And strong as normal steel. What do you think about shared universes, different book and characters that share the same world? That way you don't have to keep inventing new history and magic systems. I do that, so I think they're great. But doing so also ends up restricting yourself. The more rules you make up, the more you have to remember to follow with every book. Yeah, I already do that, you know. Technically, all right. I technically have like 10 books all in the same universe. So Al Shafalda is, here we go. It's a little dark. Hold on. Let me get my monitor to wake back up here, and then you can maybe see the cover a little bit better. All right. Al Shafalda is in the same universe as The Waking Desert. It's in the same universe as Crown of Sight. It's in the same universe as Water of Awakening and Needle Ash, the Needle Ash books. It's also technically in the same universe as Bright Children, which I need to get off Vela. I will get it off Vela for those of you who are interested in reading it. It's on the list. I'll get there eventually, right? It's also in the same universe as the Moonsong trilogy, but they're at different times and at different places. So it's all the same shared universe, but you get to explore radically different time periods, and I can just play around with a lot of stuff with that. So I like doing that kind of thing, and I like it because I do it. So it's fun, I think. I think it's a lot of fun. Lets you kind of, to me, it's more like Easter eggs for the readers, which is that, if you've read more of my books, you understand more of the references that are in the other books. You get a bigger understanding of like what's going on a deeper level, or like who this character is or was. All of them kind of pull together in different ways. And of course, Water of Awakening has a different protagonist than Needle Ash, and King Leper has a different set of protagonists than either of those books, though we have characters that visit from each of them. So that's always fun too. I kneeled and held the blade to my chest. I should do. We don't even need to say said. We'll just say a quaver. I finally slipped into my voice. Seemed to amuse the Dark Lord. Shuffled softly in response. And it was like the creaking of old rafters in a storm. Instead of echoing, we'll do reverberating. Under the verdant, and I don't want verdant, right? That means green, but we don't want that. I need another word for green. I've used like the ancient and sickly dome. Trying not to run on my way back to the gallery of sin. Or behind me. This is a good way to end this scene. A heart for a heart. So we have some clues here, right? In this little setup. There's a lot of exposition. This is what prose is really good for, is exposition, because you can do a lot of exposition in prose that you normally couldn't do through dialogue. You could do this through dialogue, but you're going to have a lot of characters kind of saying things they already know, which it's kind of bad. the Lord of some evil sounding name. Well, I'm just using Dark Lord for this example, right? I could come up with something better in a revision. This is the other thing too. When you're drafting, don't worry too much about like being perfect when you draft. Just do as good a job as you can when you draft. When you go back through, if Dark Lord is like a bad word, I'm using Dark Lord because it just sounds fun. But if it's something else like, the Lord of Sin, something cool like that, then, I have Eyes on the Walls here. Yeah, I wrote this. I started this live on a stream a couple years ago. Read that. We're giving a lot of clues here. So my original idea with this stream, I'm actually out of time, was to do this in first person, second person, third person. Maybe we'll do a paragraph. We'll pick a paragraph out of it and we'll do them in each, like rewrite it in each tense to show what we want to show. So when we write in first person, we really get to focus on what one character is experiencing and what he's focusing on. You could easily rewrite this in third person and it would work fine with third person personal. Instead of I, you'd replace all the I's with the name of the character. Xander. Xander walked down the gallery, observing more in his peripheral vision the perverse decorations of the palace. So this could easily just be changed into third person, and it doesn't really change much at all. The place that you would have to change it is where I must admit my gaze, this kind of personal thing. Like, I was resisting wanting to look at these evil things, but I did. So you would have to rewrite this as like Xander, despite his best efforts, was at times drawn away from the end of the hallway that the slim haunting figure led him toward, a place where his fate would be decided. The images were powerful, sickening, alluring, and he could feel his will to resist the power that awaited him weakening. Wait here, the hooded man said, as they reached a large set of oaken doors, carved in shapes that defied Xander's fragile sense of reality, already diminished in the strange place. That one I would probably change because that doesn't make a lot of sense in third person. We're talking about how Xander feels during that time, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to have that in third person. Probably just do a new sentence there. He caught a glimpse of a room beyond, and his heart quickened. A cool breeze escaped from the portal. Right, so what are the senses we have here? We have like a visual sense. We have an emotional response to that visual sense in the first person, which we can do. We also have the feeling of the air. We have the smell. There's a bad smell, and he's not sure if at first Xander's not sure if it is the this Dark Lord guy or if it's something in the box, and he realizes what's in the box is the heart of the woman he loves, who the Dark Lord has cut out, managed to preserve her life somehow. And when he goes and cuts out the heart of who the Dark Lord wants killed, he will exchange it for the woman that Xander loves. That's a great setup for a plot. What do we have here? We have setting characters and plot already set up here. He has to go kill someone to do this, right? Now, ideally, if I were setting this up in a book, I would try to get the conflict in the first page. So in a revision, I might add a sentence of Xander thinking about how he needed to do a job. We have like the fate that awaited him. That he couldn't resist doing this job. I might do this with a revision, right? Where his fate would be decided, where my fate would be decided. You know, I have to do what he tells me to do, or like I'll lose everything. He rewards greatly his allies, but would punish anyone who refused to do his will. You know, I might juice that up in the first page so we have an idea of like, I have to do something for the Dark Lord. And then we're going to reveal what that is, kind of slowly unleashing the horror of what we're looking at in this scene. So anyway, there's a fun little scene for you guys. It's possible to write a story in first person from multiple points of view, depending on the chapter. Dracula's a good example. That's a great example. The thing is that you can't have a character describing how they themselves die. It doesn't quite work, right? So if somebody's writing, you know that they're alive, at least at some point when they're writing it. Dracula does that, and you can totally do that, and it works great. You can also do letters and all kinds of other things. There's lots of creative things you can do. In Muramasa, I switched from third person to first person because it made more sense. Rather than having a long chapter of like quotes and, you know, it's one character telling a story to another, rather than having a long chapter of quotes like Shadow of the Past or like Council of Elrond, where there's lots of characters reacting. It's like, this is really just one guy telling a story. I just switched to first person perspective and did a chapter in first person. And then after that chapter, we went back to the normal third person perspective for the prose and for the narrative. And it worked really good. I really thought it was a good little touch. I'm like, screw it, we'll go to first person here because I don't want to deal with all the quotes and having characters react. I just want the character to tell his story, and that's all I want for this section. So Dracula uses a framing device. It's supposedly made up of letters, journal entries, and even photograph recordings. Yeah, it's good. So if you haven't read the original Dracula, it works good, right? So you can do letters. There's so many different ways that you can frame it out and use combinations of different perspectives. You could use second and first somehow, right? I do this and then you do this, and it's like you can have perspectives within it, right? Because a person, when they're speaking, speaks in a perspective, usually a first person perspective. So whenever a character is telling a story about themselves, they're actually doing a first person narrative. It's kind of weird how that works, but it's true. Right. Most journals in RPGs are basically first person perspective of people dying, which I find hilarious. Now, here's something that H.P. Lovecraft does as a framing device. Is you're reading the diary of a character, and the diary ends before the event that determines whether he lives or dies happens, right? So he finishes writing, saying he's going to go do something, and what we have is just the diary. We don't know what happened to him, but we guess that he died. So that's how we can kill someone in the first person, is like we have to kind of frame it so it's like, I found this diary of this guy and we don't know what happened to him. Maybe he died, right? And it works. It works pretty good. So anyway, guys, that's about it for today. Finger width. Maybe I'll post this. I'll post this up if people want to read this little intro. Just as an example of what you can do, a quick 1,000 words to show, what's possible with prose and the way that I would write prose. Using different senses and, also how you would frame dialogue. My writing is a lot like this. This is a lot like how I write books. So if you like it, you can read my books. They are like this. So, all right. Good to see you all. Thank you for stopping by, Lord Raging Goblin. Most journals and RPGs are funny. They're taking the time to write while they're in mortal danger. Yeah. That's an interesting one too. But anyway, I like it with H.P. Lovecraft because you can get that descent into madness. Each journal entry could be getting weirder than the last. Stephen King used it in a short story called Salem's Lot that is not the same. It's called Jerusalem's Lot. It's not the same as Salem's Lot, the vampire novel. Weird, but it's a good framing device, I think. It's like letters or journals, things like that. You can do that. All right, guys, I'll see you all next time. Have a great one. Have a great day. And, hop on the Patreon. I guess I'll link the Patreon again. You can check out the No Talkie Talkie channel. I will link the video that I'm going to play as the outro, even though it's probably pretty boring as an outro. I'll just link the video. You can watch that video. And I'll see you all next time. I don't think there's anything else. Next week, same time, like 6:30, 6:15, as soon as I can get on. And I might do another stream over the weekend at a random time, like just music only. We'll find out. So have a great one, and I'll see you all next time.